Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 303 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what is dyslexia. And it is Wednesday the 18th of December 2024 as I record this. So I'm recording it a little early because I'm having my Christmas break, so my audio booth is down in Canterbury, and I'm actually returning to Canterbury the day this podcast episode goes out. But whilst I'm in enjoying time with my family, I do not want to be recording whatsoever. So today's podcast episode is a really fun one, because after my assessment and where I got diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia, I really wanted to focus on what actually is dyslexia, because I've read bits and pieces, but I only know my lived experience. I've never really looked at dyslexia as a whole. So in today's podcast episode, I'm actually deep diving into it, and it's a really fascinating podcast episode. We talk about a lot of the symptoms, what causes dyslexia, and we also talk about how is dyslexia treated. So I know you're going to learn tons, and you're going to enjoy this just as much as I do. Also, because I'm going to a little social work gathering, which actually started half an hour ago, and I also don't have a psychology news section, I'm going to skip that section and go straight on to the sponsored product. But as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And also feel free to send pictures of where you're listening from. I always love to see hear pictures from all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology. So the reason why this is a great sponsor for today's episode is because dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental condition. So this great, really easy to understand books helps you to understand how does a child typically develop from a neurotypical viewpoint. For example, how do their brains develop? How does their cognition develop? So we look at some of like Piaget's work. We also talk about theory of the mind, autism, and some other developmental conditions. But then we also talk about the development of a language and how children learn social skills through play and so on. So this is a brilliant book. It's very popular actually because on Spotify it was actually my most popular audiobook all year in 2024. So it's a brilliant book that I highly recommend. So that's Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you requested. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, you can get it from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Baker & Taylor, Overdrive, and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you wanted to get access to tons of great awards, now you can. at patreon.com/psychologywork podcast. But if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/ConnorWhiteley. So that's enough for personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what is dyslexia. And this is a great episode. I'm really looking forward to it. And I definitely learned quite a lot about this as this is a new diagnosis that I've received. So let's dive into it. What is dyslexia? So dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental condition that causes people to have difficulty with spelling, reading comprehension and word recognition, as well as what is closely related to other learning disabilities like dysgraphia, dyspraxia and dyscalculia. This condition affects people with normal and above average intelligence too. Additionally, dyslexia is believed to be the most common learning disability, with the prevalence rate being around 5% to 17% of the population, depending on the criteria being used. As well as it is possible for someone to have more than one learning disability, which is why a comprehensive evaluation is used during diagnosis. When learning disabilities are comorbid, health professionals treat each condition separately because the different treatments that are effective for one condition might have no or little effect on another one. Like a dyslexia treatment might be useful for dyslexia, but it might be useless for dysgraphia. Personally, I knew I had dyslexia because I've always struggled with spelling and sounding out words. I just cannot do it. And found out recently that I learn a word in whole word blocks. So people normally learn by phonics. For me, phonics are useless, so I need to know what a whole word says, and I remember the whole word instead of the sounds. This is why I struggle with learning new words and knowing how to say new words. What are the symptoms of dyslexia? Whilst this wasn't the case for me, the signs and symptoms of dyslexia are typically seen in childhood, but they do appear in adults too. For me, I did a dyslexia test when I was about 14 years old, but I failed. That is definitely in air quotes. So I couldn't receive a diagnosis, but in the past few years, my dyslexia has become more severe, so I passed the screening test and the diagnosis. Moreover, a dyslexic person's reading ability is lower than average for their age, but symptoms can vary from person to person. This is why we'll look at some of the more common symptoms now, and remember, not all these symptoms will appear within everyone with dyslexia. Generally speaking, children as well as adults with dyslexia might struggle to summarize stories, speak phrases or words, and understand jokes, idioms, and other forms of wordplay. They might find it difficult to learn a second language too. Please remember that if no other symptoms are present, this is not an indicator of dyslexia. Furthermore, with dyslexia being a neurodevelopmental condition, it is common for those with dyslexia to reach common developmental milestones like walking and talking later than their peers. Then, as they get old and grow up, children and adults with the condition might struggle to participate in activities that require coordination, like those with high levels of coordination or activities that require concentration and focus. I have a lot of these difficulties, but mine can be explained slightly better by dyspraxia, a word I cannot actually spell without autocorrect on. A final general symptom for this section is that because reading is a challenge for people with dyslexia, that makes people feel like a failure at reading. It can make children and adults anxious and upset about the idea of reading, or they go to a lot of effort to avoid reading activities. Interestingly, this can unfortunately impact children's self-esteem that can last into adulthood, especially if their dyslexia continues to go undiagnosed, so they might even be called lazy or slow because they don't want to read or they struggle with it. This is why timely and accurate diagnosis is so important, because it can restore a child's and an adult's self-esteem, as well as allow them to develop strategies that work best for their particular challenges. Also, with reading being considered a critical skill for academic success, this is why a lot of people with dyslexia believe they aren't intelligent, when in reality they are intelligent. They just might need a little more support and more strategies to help them learn and thrive. What are some specific dyslexia symptoms? Firstly, a dyslexic person experiences difficulties or delays in learning to speak, read the alphabet, or how to spell. For me, I struggled so much with learning how to speak because I needed speech and language therapy for years so I could form any words at all, as I was a mute child. As well as I struggled with reading words because I couldn't sound them out, so I needed to have extra lessons that focused on sounding out words. It wasn't useful, but still. Secondly, one aspect of a dyslexia assessment is you need to recall sequence of numbers, words, and letters in a forward and reverse order. That is very difficult to recall for people with dyslexia, and I hated that part of the assessment because I was not good at it. I'm pretty sure the psychologist doing my assessment actually stopped the reverse order sequence early because she could see how bad I was at the task. Therefore, difficulty recalling sequences of numbers, letters, and actual words is another symptom of dyslexia. Thirdly, dyslexic people tend to misread one letter for another. This can include U for an N, a P for a Q, and so on. I don't have any experience of these symptoms. Fourthly, this is how I actually knew I was dyslexic, when my friends and housemates would lovingly bully me for my challenges with pronunciation. I have an amazing ability to randomly add and subtract letters of new words. I would often get asked, where's the TSR in that word? Because I would randomly add so many letters. Or I would get, there's an R in that word. Where's that in your pronunciation? So my pronunciation is rubbish. In addition, people with dyslexia typically struggle with distinguishing the sounds of one word from another. Now, I didn't think that I have any experience of this, but because my best friend, who is half French, mentioned how I don't have an ear for different sounds in French, I do remember something else too. I was talking with a housemate and we were talking about English as a language, and they said a whole bunch of words, and to me they sounded too similar for me to know the difference. Finally, people with dyslexia can struggle with recognizing what are known as sight words, for example, and, the, or it. What causes dyslexia? Whilst researchers aren't entirely sure what can cause a child to develop dyslexia, given how it can run in families, it is commonly believed there is a genetic component. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if my dad has dyslexia, but that is just a pure guess. Also, neuroimaging studies have found that the brain of children with dyslexia develop and work differently to the brains of children at the same age as those without dyslexia. This could explain why people with dyslexia have phonological difficulties that make it harder for them to distinguish between the sounds of individual letters and letter patterns in similar words like bag, ban, and bat. In addition, dyslexia isn't always a neurodevelopmental condition because it is possible to acquire dyslexia following a brain injury, stroke, or another example of a traumatic event. Then people with acquired dyslexia or alexia lose their ability to read because the rear part of the left hemisphere of the brain is damaged, so this causes difficulties identifying individual letters and numbers. How is dyslexia treated? Currently, there is no cure for dyslexia, but in the majority of the cases, it can be managed through compensatory techniques. In children with dyslexia, it's important to recognize the symptoms and then taking remedial steps as soon as possible within their journey through education so they can thrive and not risk falling behind. For this to happen, a formal evaluation is needed to uncover the specific deficit areas that the child has in reading and writing, and this differs for every child. For example, I can read books, I have no problem with enjoying reading, but I cannot read new words. I cannot sound out words, and I have massive issues with not wanting to take notes in lectures because it takes a while for me to write my notes out. As well as if I'm reading and I come across a new word, I don't even try and read it. I just acknowledge there's a weird word in there and I move on. Furthermore, there are brain-based and environmental differences between children with dyslexia that can make it easier for some children to learn compared to others. Dyslexic children tend to be taught by educators that use methods that are modified to meet an individual's needs, as well as that family support can be massively important to improve a child's self-image and prospects for success. The same individual evaluation as well as reading interventions are necessary for adults with acquired dyslexia too. In addition, as dyslexia is recognized as a disability, it is possible for a person with dyslexia to request workplace accommodations for their condition. This can include assistive technologies like text-to-write software. Also, long documents summarized for faster interpretation and replacing written documents with oral ones. Also, for some people think there is a medication option for dyslexia. This is not true. There is no medication that is recommended for dyslexia, but if a child has another condition like ADHD alongside their dyslexia, then Adderall and Ritalin can be useful for reducing ADHD symptoms, but they are not helpful with the underlying dyslexia symptoms. Finally, in terms of academic accommodations, these can be immensely useful for children with dyslexia, and they are normally a collaboration between the school staff and parents. In the United States, dyslexia is considered a disability, so it's protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So children with dyslexia are normally able to secure an individualized learning plan that includes accommodations that help them to catch up in the classroom with their peers or perform better. These accommodations depend on the severity of the child's condition and their specific symptoms, but they can include extra time on tests, use of audiobooks, options to dictate answers instead of writing them. Conclusion. After struggling with reading and pronunciation and being the joke for so long because I struggle with sound so much, it is great to finally have an understanding and a diagnosis that can explain why I struggle so much with things that other people take for granted. Also, with a dyslexia diagnosis, I feel a little validated in a way because it means I am officially dyslexic, if that makes any sense. And it isn't there an excuse or condition that I'm trying to use to explain away my difficulties, because now I actually have the condition instead of me thinking and hoping that I have it. I would have preferred to have the diagnosis when I was back at school because that would have been really, really useful for me. But now I have it, I can ask for accommodations when needed. And whilst I don't think me having a dyslexia diagnosis will impact me in the future, I'm glad that I have it during my university. Because you never know when a diagnosis that can help you more support than a stigma might be useful, especially as I enter the world of work after my final year of my degree. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. So I know that I did, because it was really useful to actually realise, oh, I've got this diagnosis. I don't actually know that much about dyslexia, except a few bits and pieces that I've read. So I really wanted to do a deep dive on this condition, just so I can understand myself, understand the areas which I'm finding, but other people struggle with, and just so I can figure out how do I explain my dyslexia to other people. So it was a lot of fun, and I did enjoy it. And if you know anyone who enjoyed today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Developmental Psychology, a guide to developmental and child psychology, available at all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/The Psychology Word Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Con Wiley. So, Happy New Year, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.